Imagine this. You're standing in the middle of an empty steppe. Around you there is only grass, wind, and sky. And then the ground under your feet gives way, and you see beneath you not soil, but stone arches, long tunnels, and halls carved deep into the earth. This is not a mine, not a farmer's cellar. This is the story of the underground warehouses of the steppe, where Tartaria hid its strategic reserves. Why do old reports show a small district exporting twice as much grain as it could ever grow? Why do old maps show roads to nowhere, all pointing to one spot in the steppe, where nothing stands today? And why do 20th century documents coldly say, liquidate dangerous underground structures, but never show a single photo of where those structures actually begin? What if the steppe is not empty land, but a lid over giant secret warehouses of a forgotten civilization? And most important, who and why did everything possible to make sure we never find out what Tartaria was hiding beneath our feet? Before we go any further, if you are curious about what else has been buried under the surface of our official history, hit that subscribe button. There is far more hidden beneath the steppe, and this is only the beginning of what I have uncovered. Let me take you back to where this whole investigation first began for me. It started with a farmer's phone video. Nothing polished, just shaky footage from a field in southern Ukraine, somewhere between Zaporizhzhia and the Sea of Azov. Flat steppe, endless grass. The kind of landscape where you can see to the horizon in every direction, and, at least on paper, there is nothing to see at all. Except this time, there was a hole. Not a small hole, a massive sinkhole, maybe 15 meters across, that had opened up overnight after heavy spring rains. The farmer was clearly shaken. You could hear it in his breathing and the way his voice kept cracking as he filmed. He had been driving his tractor across that same spot for roughly 20 years. 20 years of plowing, planting, and harvesting. And now, in a single night, the earth had simply folded in on itself and disappeared. That was only the first shock. When the drone footage appeared a few days later, because of course someone sent a drone down into that gap, it did not show what you would expect. No chaotic cone of collapsed soil, no messy tangle of roots, stones, and churned earth. Instead, the camera dipped below the edge and captured something that made me stop the clip and rewind it 3 times. Clean-cut stone arches, brick vaults, perfect barrel ceilings vanishing into darkness. Have you ever seen a natural sinkhole? I have. I have spent months traveling across the steppe, visiting collapse sites, comparing dozens of them. Natural sinkholes are chaos. Jagged rims, torn layers of rock and clay, everything broken and random. This was not that. This was man-made geometry. This was architecture. Deliberately built rooms, underground, in the middle of nowhere. The walls were not rough cave rock. They were dressed and finished, shaped. The arches had clear keystones. The vaults showed the kind of careful engineering where every single brick leans into the next, sharing the load in precise, almost mathematical balance. Who builds something like that? And more importantly, who goes to the trouble of building it under a field where nothing, officially, has ever stood? The local authorities moved quickly. Within 48 hours, the site was fenced off. Within a week, a short report appeared. Old Soviet ammunition depot, structurally unsound, area restricted for public safety. That was it. That was the whole explanation. An ammunition depot. On the surface, it sounded tidy. But there were problems. There are no records of any military installation at those coordinates. The brickwork style does not match Soviet standard patterns. I have compared it side by side, and I will show you those differences later. And real ammunition depots are built out of reinforced concrete and steel, low and practical, not with ornate stone arches that look like they were borrowed from a cathedral nave. What bothered me most was the timing, the speed, the convenience. A massive underground structure appears out of nowhere, and within days a neat, ready-made label is slapped on it. A calm, "Do not worry, we already know what this is," issued by people who, according to every document I could track down, had no idea that anything was under that field until the ground literally opened. When I started digging through local records, and yes, I actually went there, spoke with villagers, and spent weeks in dusty regional archives, I found something even stranger. That farmer with the smartphone, he was not the first person in his family to notice something odd about that land. His grandfather, back in the 1970s, had filed complaints with Soviet agricultural officials about strange echoes when tractors drove over certain strips of the field, about ground that sounded hollow under the wheels, about a patch of land that, according to his handwritten notes, sang when the wind blew wrong. They told him he was imagining things. But when I laid his old descriptions over a modern map and matched them to the sinkhole location, they lined up. Almost perfectly. The hollow spots he had drawn on a simple pencil sketch fell within a few meters of the place where the earth finally gave way. So, what is this place really? Why does it exist? And why, when I requested historical surveys of that area, did I receive polite letters saying the documents were classified for regional security reasons? An ammunition depot, they insisted. Quick, simple, and far too convenient. Unless, of course, the ammunition depot story is just the easiest way to close the file on something much older. Something that forces us to ask, who was, here before the maps we trust? Something that raises questions about what they built beneath the soil. And most unsettling of all, something that hints at what they were preparing for. A threat serious enough that it was worth hiding massive stone warehouses deep under the steppe where no one was ever supposed to find them. Because here is one thing I have learned. When the official story arrives this fast, this clean, this final, it is usually not the whole story. It is a lid. And lids are made to keep something out of sight. So what were they hiding down there? That question would not leave me alone after I walked away from that fenced-off sinkhole. Because here is the uncomfortable truth. You do not carve elaborate stone vaults under empty steppe just for the sake of it. You do not create underground architecture built to last for centuries unless you are protecting something of real value, something worthy of all that labor, time, and risk. I needed to find out what that something was. That search led me to a cramped archive room in Melitopol, about 3 hours north of the sinkhole site, the kind of place where the radiators cough more than they heat, where files sit in boxes that no one has opened for decades, where you need written permission for every single photograph you take. I spent 2 full weeks there, bent over 19th century provincial records, trade reports, harvest logs, and that is where I hit the first real crack in the story. It was hidden in a customs ledger from the year 1887. Dry reading, long columns of ink and numbers, tons of wheat, barrels of rye, shipments of barley moving down the Dnieper River toward Black Sea ports. The kind of bureaucratic list that usually makes your eyes blur by the 4th line. But when I cross-checked those export figures against the harvest reports from the same year, something refused to line up. The district in question, a remote slice of steppe with maybe 4 small villages, officially harvested 47,000 puds of grain that season. That is roughly 770 tons. A normal yield for that region, nothing remarkable. The provincial governor even called it an adequate but unremarkable harvest. Yet the customs house records at the river port claim that same district exported 89,000 puds. Let me repeat that. They shipped out almost twice as much grain as they were supposed to have grown. So, where did the extra grain come from? I assumed at first it was a simple clerical error. Maybe the scribe wrote down the wrong district. Maybe 2 neighboring regions were combined on one line. Maybe I was misreading the old Cyrillic handwriting. I spent 3 whole days checking and rechecking, comparing different ledgers, lining up dates, tracing the same district on maps to make absolutely sure I was looking at the right place. The numbers held. A remote area with no large town, no recorded granaries, no railway link. This is before the tracks reached that part of the steppe, somehow exported double its documented harvest. The rare official explanation I found in later summaries tried to smooth it over with 4 words: accumulated reserves from previous years. On paper, that sounds reasonable, until you notice that the same pattern repeats in the year 1889, and 1891, and 1893. Every few years, this district, and once I widened my search, others just like it, showed export figures far above what they supposedly produced. Not a minor surplus, not 10 or 15% extra, sometimes double, sometimes even more than that. So, where were they keeping the difference? How were they storing that volume in an era before modern refrigeration, climate-controlled silos, and industrial preservatives? And why does not a single map from that period show a granary, a warehouse complex, or any visible storage facility big enough to explain it? At that point, I started doing something simple. I took the coordinates of these overproducing districts and laid them over modern topographical data. And that is when a pattern began to emerge: hollow spots, areas with strange underground echoes reported by survey teams, places where, in several cases, sinkholes had opened over the past century, exposing, once again, stone chambers and vaults beneath what should have been solid ground. One case stood out so strongly that I pinned it to my wall: a village called Velike Tovmache, about 40 kilometers from the field where that farmer's land collapsed. In the year 1903, local officials reported to the imperial government that their district had grain stores sufficient for 7 years of hardship. 7 years. That is not a modest safety cushion from a couple of good seasons. That is strategic thinking. That is planning for siege, famine, or systemic collapse. Yet when a Soviet agricultural survey team arrived in 1931, they found no large granaries, no tall storage silos, nothing on the surface that could hold that kind of volume. Their report states, almost dismissively, local claims of historical reserves appear to be folklore and exaggeration. So, we have two options. Either the villagers lied in 1903 to imperial tax collectors, which makes no sense because you do not brag about having extra grain to the people who tax your grain, or something vanished between 1903 and 1931. Something big enough to store food for 7 years. Something that left almost no trace on the surface. Something that, by design, was underground. The written records tell one story. The physical evidence, the sinkholes, the stone vaults, the hollow ground, tells another. And in the empty space between those two narratives, there is a gap wide enough to hide an entire network of subterranean warehouses. At this point, the question is no longer just, where did the extra grain come from? The real question is, who built a system capable of hiding it so completely that even Soviet surveyors, 3 decades later, could walk across those fields and see nothing at all? When you start finding gaps in the records, you naturally begin hunting for whatever might fill them. I was sure there had to be documentation somewhere. You do not build massive underground storage systems without plans, without engineering drawings, without someone, at some point, putting pen to paper and saying, here is how we are going to do this. The real question was not if those documents existed, but where they had gone. I finally got lucky in Kherson. Not in the main state archive. They were polite, formal, and ultimately useless. But in a small regional museum that was slowly dying, selling off duplicate materials just to stay afloat. The curator, an elderly woman who had worked there for about 40 years, mentioned almost casually that they had boxes of old technical papers no one had ever properly cataloged. Most of it was exactly what you would expect. Soviet tractor manuals, irrigation diagrams, layouts of collective farms. Practical, repetitive, and frankly boring. The paperwork of an era that loved forms more than answers. And then I opened the folder. Loose sheets, yellowed and brittle, tied with string that fell apart as soon as I touched it. Inside were engineering drawings, architectural cross-sections, dense layers of thin ink lines, the kind of detailed technical plans that take months of careful work to produce. What made my hands actually shake as I photographed each page was what those drawings showed. These were plans for underground structures, long rows of barrel vaults, thick load-bearing pillars, stone stairwells spiraling down into the earth, ventilation shafts, drainage channels, every component you would need to build a huge subterranean complex built to last. What they did not show was anything above ground. No building, no facade, no roofline. No entrance hall, no tower, nothing breaking the surface at all. Just coordinates, a grid reference, and a simple label written in pre-revolutionary script, Sklad number 23, warehouse number 23, not warehouse number 23 in Melitopol, not warehouse number 23 at the Dnieper crossing, just a number and coordinates. When I plotted those coordinates on a modern map, they pointed to bare steppe, empty fields. No structures there now, no ruins marked on any historical map I could find. Just grass, wind, and a perfectly flat horizon. I kept going through the folder. Warehouse number 31. Warehouse number 47. Warehouse number 52. Each plan showed a fully realized underground layout. dimensions, materials, load calculations, air channels, drainage routes, and each one was tied to coordinates that led to nowhere. The drawings themselves were extraordinary. Whoever had designed these complexes understood structural engineering at a level that supposedly did not exist in that region at that time. The vault patterns spread weight with almost perfect symmetry. The ventilation system used the height of shafts and the difference in temperatures to create natural airflow without any pumps or fans. The drainage channels were laid out so that water would be quietly carried away by gravity alone, guided by careful geometry instead of machinery. This was not the work of amateurs. This was not, let us dig a hole and hope it does not collapse. These were sophisticated underground facilities, designed by people who knew exactly what they were doing and exactly how long they wanted these spaces to survive. But one detail kept nagging at me. The dates were wrong. Or, more precisely, they were missing. None of the drawings carried a clear construction date. No approved stamp with a year. Just warehouse numbers and locations. The curator pointed out something else. The paper stock itself suggested these were copies, reproductions made later from older originals. I am not a paper expert, so I trusted her judgment. That meant what I was holding were not the first drafts, but echoes. Copies of what, made when, and by whom. I took the coordinates from all 17 warehouse plans I could find in that single folder and pinned them on a satellite image. They formed a pattern, a network stretching across the southern steppe, each location sitting roughly 40 to 60 kilometers from the next. The spacing was almost too perfect, close enough that each site could support the others, far enough apart that one flood, one fire, or one military strike would not wipe out the entire system. It was the ideal layout for a distributed storage grid. When I zoomed in on each coordinate using modern satellite imagery, small clues began to show up. Slight depressions in the ground, irregular shadows at sunset, hinting that the surface was not completely level. In 3 spots, you could clearly see collapse zones that had been filled in. Darker soil, rough patches, traces of old excavation softened by time. The network was real. The plans were real. Which brought me back to the question that would not go away. If these underground warehouses existed, and the blueprints said they did, then where were the buildings? Where were the surface structures that should have marked their presence? Unless, of course, there were never meant to be any. Finding those blueprints did more than excite me. It gave the mystery edges, because now I knew what I was supposed to be chasing. If these underground warehouses really existed, and the plans were far too detailed, too technical to be pure fantasy, then there had to be something tying them together. You cannot run a network of hidden storage sites without infrastructure. You need access. You need routes. You need some way to move grain and supplies in and out without leaving chaos on the surface. So, I turned to maps, not modern ones. Those only show what survived into our time. I needed older eyes on the land, military cartography. The kind of maps drawn when empires genuinely cared about every track, every well, every path across the steppe that an army or a wagon might use. I found what I needed in the Russian State Military Archive, digitized but buried under layers of dry catalog numbers. Imperial Army survey maps from the 1870s and 1880s, incredibly precise. Every village, every solitary farmstead, every seasonal stream, and well marked with almost obsessive care. And there they were, roads, not main arteries, not famous trade routes. These were secondary tracks, dirt paths really, drawn as thin dotted lines crawling across the steppe. At first they looked unremarkable, until I noticed one detail. They all converged. I am staring at a map of the wider Zaporizhzhia region, and I count 6 different roads, some starting in villages, some seemingly peeling off from other tracks, all angling toward the same point. At that location, the map shows a small, distinct symbol, a circle with a cross inside it. The legend in the corner is damaged, but not beyond reading. Next to that symbol, in faded ink, you can still make out the words Sluj, Punkt, service point. Service point for what? There is no town there, no marked fort, no monastery, post station, or customs office. Just that symbol, and those roads, like spokes on a wheel. I traced the coordinates of that point and compared them to the warehouse plans. They matched warehouse number 23 from the blueprints. Maybe that was a coincidence. So I tested another. Warehouse number 31, same pattern. A knot of minor roads all converging on a service point. Warehouse number 47. Roads again, same symbol, same label. Warehouse number 52, same story. Every single warehouse location from those underground plans lined up with a service point symbol on these imperial military maps from the 1870s, which means the Russian Imperial Army knew these places existed. They mapped the access routes that led to them. They considered them important enough to be included in official survey work meant for officers and planners. And then the trail bends. I pulled a later map from the archive, printed in 1910. Same region, same scale, produced by the same military cartographic office. The roads were still there, at least most of them. Faint lines now, but clearly copied from earlier surveys. But the symbols? Gone. Where service points had been marked clearly 40 years earlier, there was now nothing at all. Just blank tan shading for steppe grass. No circles, no crosses, no notes. Why would you deliberately remove landmarks from a military map? Over time, maps usually gain detail. You correct mistakes, add new settlements, include more bridges, more wells, more infrastructure. You do not usually strip things away, unless someone, somewhere, decided that those service points should no longer be visible, should no longer be discussed, should not officially exist. By the 1930s, Soviet topographical maps of the same zone show even less. The mesh of minor roads has been simplified. Many tracks are gone entirely. The network that was carefully recorded in the 1870s has been thinned out, blurred, and, in some cases, erased. Not just from the ground, but from the paper that tells you where to look. But paper is only one memory. The land has its own. Old roads leave scars. Even when they are not driven anymore, the soil they once carried stays different, compacted, thinner, sometimes with different plants growing along the line. Modern satellite imagery is sensitive enough to catch those subtle stripes, faint, straight variations in color and vegetation where wagons once passed, season after season. I overlaid the imperial map from the 1870s with a high-resolution satellite image. The old tracks, those dotted lines, lined up with faint, pale bands on the modern picture. The roads are still there, ghost lines scratched across the steppe, leading straight to points that official history now insists are empty. Because here is the thing. Roads never lead to nowhere. They always led somewhere. To a well, to a farm, to a post station, or, in this case, to something hidden. If the roads are still etched into the land, but the destinations have vanished from our maps, that tells us two things. First, those places were real enough that people built paths to them. Second, at some later point, someone wanted those endpoints to disappear from memory. So, when you see a cluster of old roads all pointing toward nothing, the question is not, why do they go there? The real question is, what used to be there that someone wanted us to stop seeing? Maps can only take you so far. Eventually, you have to step onto the land itself. I spent 3 months crossing the southern steppe, following the coordinates I had gathered, warehouse points, service markers, places where old roads once met and now supposedly led to nowhere. That was when the pattern began to take shape. The first site was near Tokmak, about 70 kilometers from the original sinkhole. At first glance, it was just flat grassland, endless, featureless. But when you walk it, you notice something subtle. The ground isn't perfectly flat. There's a low, almost circular rise, maybe 2 meters high and 40 meters across. It doesn't look natural. Natural hills here are uneven, twisted by wind and rain. This one was too clean, too precise, like geometry disguised as landscape. I walked the perimeter. On the southern edge, faint wheel ruts still pressed into the soil, exactly where the imperial map from the 1870s marked a road. And when I stood in the center and shouted, "Yes, I actually tried it," the echo came back wrong, not a normal echo. The sound was absorbed, then released deeper, as if the ground itself was breathing it out, like shouting into a buried bell. The locals knew about it. In the nearest village, they called it the humming hill. They said that when the wind blows a certain way, the earth sings, low, resonant tones that make the grass shiver. One old man told me his grandfather called it the Khan's storehouse, a place where ancient rulers hid grain and gold for the dark times. When I asked if anyone had ever dug there, he shook his head. During Soviet times, they warned us to stay away. Said there's an old structure underneath, dangerous, could collapse. Sound familiar? The second site, near Huliaipol, was almost identical. Another perfect rise, same traces of old roads, same strange acoustics. A different village, different people, but the same name, Humming Hill, and the same warning, stay away, the ground is not safe. The third site, west of Melitopol, was even more telling. The rise there was taller, maybe 3 meters high, and at some point decades ago, someone had tried to dig it open. You could still see where they had started excavating before the hole was quickly refilled and sealed with a thin layer of concrete. At the edge of that filled trench, the truth had briefly shown itself. Beneath the dirt, exposed for just a few inches, was brickwork, the curve of an arch leading down into darkness. 3 separate sites, 70 to 80 kilometers apart, all sharing the same signature. Artificial hills and flat terrain, roads converging on each site, acoustic anomalies, echoes, hums, distorted sound, local legends about hidden storage, official warnings to keep away. That is not coincidence. That is design. A system built deliberately, and later concealed with the simplest camouflage imaginable. By reshaping the surface to look like nature itself, I returned to the blueprints, 17 numbered warehouses. Then I cross-referenced them with folklore archives, where ethnographers had once cataloged local legends about singing or humming hills. 14 matched, 14 places where imperial maps, local myths, acoustic anomalies, and underground engineering drawings all pointed to the same conclusion. Something is buried down there, something vast, something that stretches hundreds of kilometers across the steppe. This is not one collapsed bunker, not one random Soviet depot, not one strange accident. It's a network, an underground grid hidden beneath the grass, built with precision and intent. A structure so large, so well designed, that even after a century of erasure, it keeps breaking through sinkholes, folklore, and the faint hum of air vibrating under your feet. And that leaves the question that haunts every step of this investigation. Who built something this massive, and who spent the last 100 years making sure we'd never discover it? If you want to hide something massive, you do not leave it standing alone in the middle of nowhere. You camouflage it. You put something obvious on top, something that explains why the soil is disturbed, why roads appear on maps, why people come and go. That line of thinking led me straight to the forts. The steppe is littered with them. Star-shaped earthwork fortifications, shallow moats, old artillery positions scattered across Ukraine and the south of Russia. Most date to the 18th and 19th centuries. Frontier defenses thrown up during wars, border disputes, and the slow imperial push across the grasslands. They appear on every historical map. They are described in military manuals, in official reports, in academic monographs. On paper, they are the opposite of a mystery, or so it seemed at first. I started with the Kamyanka Fort, east of Dnipro, a textbook star fort. 5-pointed bastions, earthen ramparts about 4 meters high, a shallow ditch, neat angles. Historical surveys describe it as a typical Imperial Russian position from the 1770s, one link in the defensive chain against Ottoman raids. Standard military architecture. Everything above ground looks exactly like the diagrams. But then, I found the original construction diary, a leather-bound journal kept by the engineering officer who supervised the fort's building. Buried between notes about wages, deliveries, and weather, there was a short passage that refused to fit the clean, official story. The men complain of cool drafts rising from beneath the northern bastion. We have located a passage leading downward, lined with stone of unknown origin. The colonel has ordered it sealed, and no mention made in the official reports. A passage, leading downward, lined with stone, of unknown origin. Why would you leave that out of the official record? Why seal it instead of studying it, especially if you were the one supposedly building everything from scratch? And why would an engineer, whose job is literally to know what is being built, use the phrase of unknown origin about the stone beneath his own fort? Once you see a crack like that, you start testing other points. At Bolrad, near the Danube, a 19th century military memoir casually mentions, cool tunnels under the fort where grain was kept so it would never spoil. The officer writing it treats those tunnels as ordinary, as if anyone reading would nod and say, of course, every fort has those. But when I pulled the architectural plans for Bolrad, precise blueprints showing every rampart, barracks, storeroom, powder magazine, there was nothing beneath the surface. No tunnels, no cellar network, no cold chambers big enough to serve as grain stores. On paper, the cool tunnels never existed. Then there is the Perekop Fortress, the massive defensive line guarding the narrow neck of land into Crimea. Official guides talk about walls, moats, heroic last stands. If you ask the right people off camera, workers, locals whose families have lived nearby for generations, they will quietly mention the lower levels. Rooms under the fort, corridors, spaces that are closed, locked, or simply not discussed with tourists. In the 1990s, ground-penetrating radar surveys were carried out there to assess structural stability. The scans revealed large voids under parts of the fortress, significant empty spaces. The report notes them, then carefully labels them as possible natural karst formations, and recommends no excavation due to structural risk. Possible, natural, no excavation. 3 small phrases that closed the door on further questions. A pattern began to emerge. Across at least 8 major fortifications in the southern steppe belt, I found references to something below, sometimes in personal diaries, sometimes in local oral history, sometimes in cautious lines inside geological surveys. Chambers, tunnels, vaults beneath the forts. Yet in the official architectural documentation, the drawings, the cross-sections, the inventories, those lower spaces simply do not exist. The forts themselves were built in the 1700s and 1800s. That part is well supported. But what if they were not built on untouched ground? What if the military engineers arrived, found something already there, an older layer of underground structures, and made a deliberate choice? Use it, seal it, but do not write it down. That would explain a lot. It would explain why some forts have cool tunnels no one ever recorded building, why a construction officer describes stone of unknown origin beneath his bastion, why certain passages were ordered sealed and kept out of official reports, because acknowledging them would mean admitting the empire was not the first builder here, that someone earlier had left behind something the new rulers could not fully explain. In that light, the forts are not the primary secret, they are the cover story. The underground warehouses, the older network, came first. The forts came later, dropped onto the same coordinates like heavy lids, both to use the spaces below and to hide them in plain sight. And if that is true, then this buried system predates the 18th century. It predates the Russian Empire. It reaches back beyond the neat timelines we were given in school. So, the question shifts, again. Who built the first level, the stone beneath the forts? And why has every power that followed treated it as something to use, to seal, and above all to deny ever existed at all? Once you start seeing the pattern, it will not leave you alone. After realizing the forts were sitting on top of something older, I began looking at every structure, every lonely feature in those regions with new eyes. What else could be camouflage? What else might be leftover infrastructure from a much earlier system, still visible but mislabeled? That is when I really noticed the wells. They are scattered all across the steppe, stone rings rising out of the ground, usually about 1 meter high, with thick carved rims and deep, narrow shafts dropping into darkness. You pass them in fields, beside old roads, near abandoned villages. Most people assume they are exactly what they appear to be, water wells from centuries ago. Except a lot of them do not actually reach water. I first caught this detail near Berdyansk. I was checking another warehouse coordinate, and about 200 meters away from it stood one of these stone wells. It was beautifully built, tight masonry, a carefully shaped rim with decorative carving, the kind of work that requires skilled hands and time. I picked up a rock, dropped it in, and counted. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, thud, 6 seconds. That is roughly 40 to 50 meters of depth, depending on the exact angle of the shaft. Deep enough that, in that region, you should absolutely hit groundwater. The local water table sits around 20 to 30 meters down. But When I borrowed a long rope and a flashlight from a nearby farmer and actually looked, I did not see water at all. The shaft walls were dry stone, worn smooth. At the bottom, there was no glimmer, no damp soil, just what looked very much like flagstones. A floor. The farmer told me everyone knows it is dry. Ventilation shaft, he said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. From the old military times. Ventilation for what? There is nothing visible there, no fort, no bunker, no obvious structure of any era. But there was a warehouse coordinate, warehouse number 31, sitting right there, about 200 meters away. After that, I started checking every well I could find near the warehouse sites. Out of 11 I was able to inspect closely, 9 were completely dry, deep, perfectly crafted, and utterly without water. Then came the photographs, which made everything even stranger. In regional archives, I found images from the 1890s and early 1900s showing some of these very same wells. You can match them by the surrounding landscape and distinctive stonework. In several of those old photos, the wells are not just bare rings. They have wooden towers built over them, 3 or 4 meters tall, with what looks like either a windmill mechanism or a metal cap mounted at the top. By the 1950s, in later photographs, the towers are gone, cut away. All that remains are open stone rings around dark shafts. Why would anyone build elaborate wooden superstructures over wells that do not contain water? What were those mechanisms actually doing? I showed the images to a friend of mine, an engineer who specializes in historical ventilation systems. He looked at the tower designs, traced the blades and housings with his finger, and said, "That is an airflow regulator. You would use something like this to control ventilation in a large underground space. The windmill catches the breeze, creates a pressure difference, pushes fresh air down, and pulls stale air up. Ventilation. For underground spaces. Spaces that, officially, do not exist. I mapped every dry well I could find, documented in archives, survey notes, or old photographs, then plotted them on satellite images alongside the warehouse coordinates. They lined up. Almost perfectly. Every warehouse site had between 1 and 4 of these stone shafts within roughly 300 meters. They were positioned at the corners of what would be the underground structure, if you lay the blueprints over the land the way an engineer would. These are not wells, they never were. They are ventilation shafts for a massive underground system, shafts that once carried carefully regulated air, topped with working wind-driven mechanisms, maintained as part of a living network, until someone, at some later stage, systematically removed the towers, cut them down, stripped away the machinery, left only the stone rings, now dismissed as old, dry wells that no one bothers to question. The locals remember them vaguely as ventilation from military times, but if you ask which army, which decade, which structure, no one can say. The story has been blurred just enough that people accept the label without looking deeper, but the shafts are still there, 40 or 50 meters deep, precisely placed, still open to the sky, still breathing in a sense, even though we no longer remember what they were built to keep alive. And if these shafts are indeed ventilation for underground warehouses, they tell us something crucial about their builders. Whoever designed this network understood that stored grain needs air circulation, that underground chambers must be kept dry and stable, that you cannot simply dig a hole and shovel food into it and expect it to last. This was not guesswork. This was advanced infrastructure, thought through, tested, refined by people who were planning for the long term, people whose practical knowledge of climate control, airflow, and preservation we have somehow managed to lose almost completely. Let me show you a pattern that should not exist. I began pulling together trade records, harvest reports, export tallies, anything I could find on grain production in the steppe over the last 3 centuries. Because if this underground network really existed, if it really served as a strategic grain reserve, then it should leave fingerprints, anomalies, moments where the official numbers refuse to line up. And those moments are there, again and again. Let us start with the early modern era, the 1600s and 1700s. European travel accounts describe endless grain caravans leaving the steppe, Ukrainian and southern Russian wheat feeding Constantinople, filling Polish granaries, pouring into markets around the Mediterranean. Even then, the region is already known as a breadbasket. But here is the strange part. The same sources that praise the volume of grain also describe farming methods that are crude. Wooden plows, little or no crop rotation, almost no use of fertilization. By any serious agricultural standard, the yield should have been mediocre at best. Yet the grain keeps flowing, year after year, even in seasons they describe as poor or failed. Jump ahead to the 19th century. Railways arrive, and suddenly we have precise data. Bills of lading, station logs, exact tonnage of grain moving from specific districts to specific ports. The pattern holds, the steppe produces, the steppe exports. The volumes are steady, predictable, almost unnaturally stable for a region supposedly relying on primitive methods and subject to weather, war, and disease. In one letter from a British grain merchant dated 1883, he complains to his partners in London. He has traveled to southern Ukraine, expecting to see enormous visible stockpiles, the great grain elevators he has been told about. Instead, he writes, "The stores they show me cannot account for the volume they offer for sale. When I inquire where the surplus is kept, I receive only vague gestures toward regional facilities." Regional facilities. Not named, not shown. Just waved at, somewhere over the horizon. Then comes the 20th century, the Soviet period, and the story turns surreal. During the Russian Civil War, from 1918 to 1921, the steppe becomes a battlefield. Armies sweep back and forth, farms burn, tracks are torn up, famine grips city after city. It is total chaos. Yet in 1922, barely after the Bolsheviks secure control, grain exports from the steppe resume almost at once. The official story is recovery of agricultural production. But real agricultural recovery takes time. You have to rebuild farms, repair equipment, repopulate villages, plant fields, and then wait a full season for harvest. That is years of work. Here, we are talking about months. So, where did that grain come from? The same question appears during the Second World War. The region is under German occupation from 1941 to 1943. Fighting rips through it. The retreating army leaves scorched earth. Fields are mined, barns and granaries are blown up or looted. Villages are flattened. Yet by 1944, barely a year after liberation, Soviet documents show grain being shipped from the steppe to feed the Red Army. Not symbolic amounts, industrial quantities. How? The reports talk about heroic rapid recovery and reserves from collective farms. But which collectives? The ones that were artillery ranges half a year earlier. When I compared all this with modern grain production, the picture became even stranger. The very same regions today, with mechanized agriculture, chemical fertilizers, modern storage, and satellite-guided planting, produce roughly the same annual tonnage as they did in the 1880s. The technology today is incomparably better. The methods are scientific, the logistics are global, and yet, the output is not dramatically higher. What if the explanation is blunt and simple? What if, in the 1880s and earlier, they were not just selling what they grew that year? What if they also drew on reserves, deep, hidden stocks of grain stored in conditions that kept it usable for many years, maybe decades? What if the steppe never truly produced as much as it exported on paper? What if, year after year, it was quietly releasing grain from an older, much larger stockpile? That would explain the stability. The way exports kept flowing even when wars, droughts, or epidemics should have crippled production. It would explain how the region kept feeding empires when the visible farms and barns could not possibly account for the numbers. And it would explain why every state that ruled this land, the Russian Empire, then the Soviet Union, treated certain empty zones with unusual care. Why they mapped them in fine detail, then later erased them from new maps. Why they built forts on top of them. Why they sealed and demolished underground structures, always with the same phrase, for safety reasons. They were not guarding bare soil. They were guarding access points. Access to strategic reserves they had not built, but inherited. Reserves from a system so old and so vast that even using a slice of it could feed armies, carry a country through famine, and keep an empire alive while the surface burned. The steppe that fed empires was not just growing grain, it was sitting on top of it. So, if these reserves really existed, if they were still being used well into the 20th century, what happened to them? That question led me into the darkest part of this whole investigation. I was working in a provincial archive in Kherson when I came across a plain cardboard box filed under the title Infrastructure Liquidation, 1947 to 1962. Nothing about it screamed mystery. It sounded like the driest kind of paperwork. The sort of box you would normally skip without a second thought. But I was being thorough, and inside that box, things took a sharp turn. Stack after stack of demolition reports. Dry technical documents with headings like Elimination of Hazardous Underground Structures in Rural Regions and Sealing of Obsolete Military Objects, Southern District. No dramatic language, no clear description of what these structures actually were. Just rows of numbers. Cubic meters of brick removed, tons of rubble used as fill, shafts sealed with concrete, tunnels collapsed with controlled charges. The reports covered roughly 15 years, from 1947 through 1962. Dozens of sites spread across Ukraine, the south of Russia, and into Kazakhstan, each one listed with coordinates, each marked completed, each stamped and signed off by regional officials and by ministries in Moscow. What exactly were they tearing down? On paper, the reports called them obsolete military objects or structurally unsound underground facilities, generic labels, safe labels, phrases designed to make you nod and move on. But a few of those files had attachments, and that is where the mask slipped. Somebody had forgotten to remove some of the photographs, black and white images, grainy but clear enough, taken during the demolition work. What they showed did not look like 20th century bunkers, massive stone blocks, arches rising 4 or 5 meters overhead, barrel vaults with flawless curves, walls where the masonry was so tight you could barely see the lines between individual stones. In one photograph, a group of workers stands next to a section of wall for scale. The blocks beside them are huge. Some look as if they weigh several tons, precisely carved, perfectly fitted. The style is closer to a cathedral crypt than to a Soviet-era storage room. Another image shows a corridor receding into darkness, arch after arch marching away from the camera, the tunnel stretching beyond the reach of the flash. It feels more like a subterranean avenue than a simple cellar. These were not small farm cellars, not quick wartime shelters. This was monumental underground architecture, and the reports described in bland language how it was destroyed, systematically, site after site. I took the coordinates from those demolition files and cross-checked them against my warehouse map. There were 8 direct matches, 8 locations where I already had blueprints, where folklore talked about humming hills, where old military maps had marked service points, all officially demolished between 1947 and 1962. Why? The documents blamed public safety and risk of collapse. But if the danger was so urgent, why did the work stretch across a decade and a half? Why not simply brick up the entrances, put up warning signs, and leave the structures in place underground, the way authorities usually do, with unstable mines or caves? Because this was not only about safety, it was about removal, about making these places disappear, not just securing them, about ensuring that future generations would not stumble onto these spaces and start asking the same questions I am asking now. One report in particular stood out. It concerned a site near Tokmak, which you might recognize as one of my Humming Hill locations. The demolition notes mention removal of interior stone features and dismantling of ventilation mechanisms. Then there was a line that stopped me cold. Inscriptions on lower chamber walls copied per instruction and removed via controlled explosion. Inscriptions on the walls, important enough that someone ordered them copied before the chambers were blown apart. Important enough to destroy the originals so no one else could ever see them. What did those inscriptions say? What language were they in? Who wrote them and when? The report does not explain. It simply notes that the texts were copied per instruction, which means someone higher up the chain wanted a record preserved but did not want the physical evidence left in place. I went hunting for those copies. I filed requests with 3 different archives for any documents matching the description. Transcriptions or photographs of wall inscriptions taken during underground demolition work near Tokmak in that time frame. Every answer came back the same. Documents classified under national security protocols. National security. For texts inside an underground chamber that officially never existed, inside a facility described only as an obsolete military object. They found something down there, something carved into the stone, something significant enough to preserve in secret, then bury under tons of rubble in silence. This was not routine cleanup. This was a campaign of erasure, a slow, methodical effort to wipe an entire layer of infrastructure off the map and out of living memory. Whatever Tartaria, or whoever came before the empires we know, built beneath the steppe, someone in the 20th century made it their mission to break it, bury it, and classify the pieces. And for the most part, it worked. Almost. I need to be honest with you, because this is the moment where everything I had built in my head started to crack. I was confident, maybe too confident. I had blueprints, demolition reports, folklore, strange echoes, export anomalies, all of it pointing in my mind toward one thing: a huge underground network built by an earlier advanced civilization. Tartaria hiding beneath the steppe, feeding empires for centuries. It felt solid. It felt like the pieces clicked. And then I made the one mistake every researcher should make. I showed my evidence to people who did not agree with me. The first was Dr. Katerina Bondar, a historian who specializes in Imperial Russian infrastructure. We met at a conference in Kyiv. I pulled out the warehouse blueprints, the same ones with no construction dates, and laid them in front of her like a trump card. She glanced at them for maybe half a minute and said, almost casually, "These are late 19th century, 1880s I would say, ice houses and cold storage facilities. There was a huge construction boom after the railway reached this region. They are well documented." Before I could argue, she opened her laptop. Within seconds, she had official Imperial Agricultural Ministry records on the screen. Documents describing the construction of underground, kolodilniki, cold storage chambers across the southern provinces. Dozens of them built between 1875 and 1895 to preserve grain for export markets. The layouts in those files matched my mysterious blueprints almost exactly. I pushed back. I showed her the demolition photographs, the massive blocks, the monumental feel of the construction. "Imported limestone," she said, "from Crimean quarries, expensive, but export merchants could afford it. Good insulation, stable temperature, low humidity. Exactly what you want for grain storage." Every point I raised, she had an answer for. Sourced, referenced, completely ordinary. Where I saw hidden Tartarian engineering, she saw late imperial infrastructure. Then I went to a geologist, Dr. Yevhen Kovalenko, who has spent about 20 years studying karst formations in southern Ukraine. I showed him my humming hills, played recordings of the echoes, explained the strange sound behavior. "Karst," he said without hesitation. "Natural limestone caves. That region is full of them. Sound goes wild in karst systems. Resonance, standing waves, odd echoes. You can get all sorts of effects. It is thoroughly studied." He opened geological surveys on his computer, maps of natural cave systems beneath the steppe, huge networks formed over millions of years as water dissolved limestone. Some of them might have been enlarged by people, he admitted. Used for storage, sure, but the base structure, natural. What about the perfect vaults, the neat stonework I kept pointing to? "If you want to store anything in a cave, you reinforce it," he replied. "You line the walls, you add arches, you stabilize the ceiling. That is just basic engineering. You would do the same thing today." I felt the ground moving under my feet. Each piece of evidence that had excited me was suddenly being folded back into normal, boring history. Imperial cold storage, natural caves, Soviet bunkers, routine demolition of unsafe structures. The final hit came from satellite analysis. Those 17 warehouse locations I had been so proud of, I asked a remote sensing specialist to look at them properly. She analyzed ground deformation patterns, historical imagery, and classified military photos. The verdict was brutal. 3 of my supposed warehouse sites had modern concrete bunkers built in the 1960s, clearly visible in declassified satellite images. 5 showed subsidence patterns consistent with natural karst collapse, no sign of artificial geometry at all. 2 were actually documented 19th century grain elevators, above-ground structures that had been demolished in the early Soviet years, with nothing particularly mysterious about them. My 17 ancient Tartarian warehouses shrank to maybe 7 locations that still looked odd. Maybe. That night I sat in my apartment, staring at the wall I had covered with photos, maps, and printouts. Red strings connecting everything like a crime board, and I had to ask myself a question I really did not want to ask. Had I just stitched together normal history into a beautiful story that I wanted to believe? Had I taken real grain storage complexes from the 1880s, natural cave systems, routine Soviet demolitions, and woven them into a grand hidden civilization narrative because it felt more exciting than the truth? Had I fallen into the same trap that catches almost every alternative researcher at some point, seeing patterns that are not really there because I needed them to be there? Evidence that had felt like solid rock a week earlier now felt like sand running through my fingers. Maybe there was no vast Tartarian underground grid. Maybe there was no secret civilization feeding empires from below. Maybe this was just what history usually is when you strip away the drama. Messy, complicated, and most of the time, painfully ordinary. Maybe, I thought for the first time, I was wrong about everything. I almost gave up. I really did. For about 2 weeks after those conversations, I did not touch my notes. I avoided the folders on my computer. I walked past my own research wall like it belonged to someone else. I kept asking myself if I was just another person on the internet, weaving elaborate stories out of fragments of misunderstood history. But one detail would not let me go. It sat in the back of my mind like a stone in a shoe. Those demolition photographs, the ones that showed massive stone blocks being hauled out of so-called obsolete military objects. Dr. Bondar had written them off as imported Crimean limestone from the 1880s. Expensive, yes, but documented in the archives. The problem was, I had actually been to one of those sites, the Tokmak location, the one where the ground had partially collapsed, revealing a cross-section of whatever lay below before the authorities rushed in and sealed it. And what I saw there was not one uniform structure, but 3 distinct layers. At the top, there was modern concrete, clearly 20th century work, rough Soviet mix, poured into simple forms, full of aggregate and air pockets. That is what you see from the surface. Beneath that, a layer of red brick, 19th century style, machine-made, uniform, the same standard imperial. Russian bricks you can still find in old factories and railway depots. That layer fit perfectly with what Dr. Bondar had described. But below the brick, there was something else entirely. Stone blocks. Large, precisely cut blocks, laid so tightly that I could not even slide a fingernail between the joints. I had photographed them before the site was sealed. When I went back to those images with a more skeptical eye, I noticed something I had glossed over before. The lower blocks did not look like the upper layers at all. The style was different. The way the edges had weathered was different. The craftsmanship was on another level. I needed to know, not just feel, that this difference was real. So I did something that was probably not fully legal. Before the workers covered everything in concrete, I collected tiny samples, chips of mortar and stone from each layer, wrapped in labeled foil packets. I sent the samples to a materials lab, told them I was studying historical construction techniques, and asked for composition analysis and approximate age estimates based on material degradation. Nothing dramatic, just data. The results came back about 3 weeks later. The concrete was exactly what you would expect, modern Soviet composition, consistent with mid-20th century standards. No surprises. The brick layer mortar matched too, 19th century production, consistent with work from the 1870s to 1890s. Everything lined up with the official story, and with Dr. Bondar's interpretation. But the lowest stone and mortar samples came back with a note attached. Samples show unusual composition. Mortar contains binding agents not consistent with known 19th century methods in this region. Stone weathering patterns suggest significantly greater age, but contamination from upper layers makes precise dating difficult. Recommend further testing. I asked for more detail. The lab manager called me directly. Look, he said, I do not want to stamp a number on this that I cannot defend. But this mortar, it is not like what we see in regional construction from that period. The lime to aggregate ratio is different. There are trace minerals that point to a different source location. and the bonding patterns suggest it has been curing much longer than about 150 years. Possibly much longer. How much longer? I asked. He sighed. I cannot prove this without more samples and more extensive testing. But if you force me to guess, 300 years at minimum, maybe more. 300 years. That pushes us back into the 1600s or earlier, before the Russian Empire fully controlled this region, before the documented cold storage boom of the 1880s. I took out the demolition photos again and studied them with a magnifying glass. I focused only on the lowest visible courses of stone. Small details began to stand out. The tool marks on the lower blocks were not the same as the marks on the upper layers. The bricks above showed regular mechanical patterns, sharp edges, predictable chipping. The stones below bore traces of hand tools, but not crude ones. The cuts were clean, the angles consistent, the faces smooth with a level of care that does not happen by accident. This was master-level stonemasonry. In one image, you can see something else. An inscription, just barely visible on the edge of a lower block. It is cropped, incomplete, but clear enough to see that it is not Cyrillic. The shapes of the letters are wrong. The script looks older, more angular, like it belongs to a different alphabet altogether. That is what the demolition report mentioned. That is what they copied per instruction before the explosives went in. That is what is now sealed away under national security in some archive. I showed a selection of these close-up photos to a mason, not a historian, not an academic, just someone who has spent decades cutting and setting stone. He did not care about Tartaria or cold storage theories. He looked at the layers and said, without hesitation, different crews. The top brickwork is just standard, quick, cheap, functional. But whoever cut those bottom stones, that is cathedral-grade work. That is people who trained for years. So, here is what we actually have, stripped of speculation. There is later construction sitting on top of something older. The 19th century builders clearly modified and expanded underground spaces in the 1880s. That much the records show. But the material evidence says they did not create all of these chambers from bare earth. They found something already there, solid, carefully built, already engineered to bear weight. And they chose to use it, to adapt it, to extend it, just like the forts. The official history is not entirely wrong. There really was a wave of cold storage construction in the 1880s. But those projects were not always starting from zero. In some places, they were installations inside structures that were already old when the first imperial engineer set foot there. And that single shift in perspective changes everything. Once I confirmed that the lowest stone layers were older than they should be, I knew I had to go back. Back to the one place that was still, at least partly, open. Most of the sites had already been sealed, but near Velik Tovmach, that same village that once claimed reserves for 7 years of hardship, a partial collapse in 2019 had exposed a chamber the authorities had not yet completely filled. Local officials had done the usual minimum, put up a fence, nailed on a few warning signs, filed a report about ground instability. Full demolition, though, was still stuck somewhere between budget problems and paperwork. Their delay became my opening. I went at night. I am not proud of that, but I needed to see what was down there with my own eyes, not through someone else's lens or in a lab report. The entrance was a torn wound in the soil where the ground had given way, about 3 meters across. I anchored a rope, clipped into my climbing gear, and eased myself down into a darkness my headlamp could barely cut. I landed in a hallway, not a cave, not a rough, hacked-out tunnel, a hallway. The vaulted ceiling rose maybe 4 meters above me. Stone walls flanked me on both sides, perfectly vertical, smooth to the touch. Under my boots there was no loose earth, only flagstones laid in a careful, repeating pattern. The space felt huge. Every step I took came back to me in long, layered echoes, the kind that tell you the room you see is only a small piece of a much larger volume. My light died into black before it ever found the far end. I started walking, slowly, filming everything on my phone. The vault continued ahead of me, arch after arch after arch, each span identical in height, width, and rhythm. It felt less like a storage corridor and more like the nave of an underground cathedral. Then I tried something I had only read about in old accounts. I stopped in the center of the passage and clapped my hands once. The sound returned, but not like a normal echo off flat walls. It came back in layers, stacked on top of each other, as if the space itself were answering. The shape of the vault focused the sound, strengthened it, and sent it rolling down the length of the corridor in waves. I spoke a few words. My voice carried perfectly, even when I dropped to a whisper. No distortion, no muddy reverb, just a clean, amplified reflection. The acoustics were not an accident. They were intentional. This was not just a big room where someone happened to store things. This was built for sound. Think about what that means. In a world before radio, before telephones, before any electronics at all, you still had to give orders, coordinate workers, move information in total darkness underground. These vaults function as acoustic amplifiers. Stand in one chamber, speak at a normal volume, and your words are projected forward. Through connecting tunnels, through branching corridors, your voice could travel without shouting. The architecture itself becomes a communication system. I kept going. Side chambers opened off the main hall. Smaller rooms, but with the same vaulted ceilings and the same impossibly precise stonework. In one of those side rooms, my light caught something that made my hands shake as I recorded. Carved into the wall at about chest height was a band of symbols. Not random scratches or board graffiti. Deeply cut, deliberate markings. Geometric patterns. Circles, intersecting lines, angled forms, repeating in sequences like text or code. I am not an expert in ancient scripts. I do not know what those symbols say. But I know what they are not. They are not Cyrillic. They are not Latin. They are not any alphabet I recognize from modern regional use. And they are carved deep into the stone, not lightly etched. Whoever put them there wanted them to survive. The temperature in the chambers never seemed to change. Cool, but not freezing. Maybe 12 to 14 degrees Celsius. Exactly the kind of range you want for long-term grain storage. No condensation on the stone, no smell of mold, no rot. Just dry, stable air. The ventilation system was still working. I could feel a faint movement of air on my skin when I stopped to stand quietly. This place had been sealed for decades, yet the air still flowed. Those wells, the vertical shafts we had called ventilation, were clearly still linked to this network and still doing their job. Whoever designed this understood more than just how to stack stones. They understood heat exchange. They understood airflow. They understood how to maintain a controlled climate underground without fans, motors, or electricity. And they understood sound. These were not just storage halls. They were tuned spaces, resonant, responsive. If you imagine hundreds of such chambers tied together by corridors and nodes, all sharing similar acoustic properties, you start to see more than warehouses. You see a communication grid running under the steppe. A person speaking in one chamber could, in theory, send their voice traveling kilometers through the system, chamber to chamber, reflected and carried by the geometry itself. That is not primitive. That is not dig a hole and throw in some sacks of wheat. That is sophisticated engineering using physics and geometry to solve problems we now hand off to electronics and fiber optics. I stayed down there for about 2 hours, filming, taking notes, forcing myself to record as much as I could before the fear finally caught up with me, and I climbed back toward the small circle of night sky overhead. 3 days later, they sealed the entrance, poured concrete, posted guards. Someone had noticed the cut fence and decided to finish the job. But by then, I had seen it. I had filmed it. The record existed outside their walls. These were never just warehouses. Whatever they started as, or became, they were part of something far more complex. After seeing those chambers with my own eyes, one question would not let me go. If these ancient underground structures work so well, why did later builders fail so badly when they tried to copy them? Because they did fail. Spectacularly. I found the proof in Soviet agricultural archives, technical reports from the 1950s and 1960s, when the government launched a huge program to build modern underground grain storage all across the steppe. On paper, the logic was perfect. Underground storage meant stable temperatures, protection from pests, lower spoilage. The Soviets had reinforced concrete, pumps, fans, engineering institutes, design bureaus. They were going to modernize how the steppe stored food. They built dozens of these facilities, poured what the reports describe as many millions of rubles into the program, and most of those storages were either shut down or written off within barely a decade. I came across a detailed assessment from 1967 about a storage complex near Melitopol, and, ironically, it stood less than 20 kilometers from one of the old humming hills I had investigated earlier. The complaints ran for pages. Persistent moisture accumulation on internal walls despite waterproofing, mold growth in corner zones, temperature fluctuations beyond acceptable parameters, grain spoilage rates 300% higher than projected, structural cracking observed in ceiling elements after 5 years of operation, recommendation, facility closure, and replacement with above-ground alternatives. They had used everything modern: reinforced concrete shells, industrial ventilation, carefully calculated air channels, thermometers, control systems. The projects were signed off by qualified Soviet engineers with diplomas on their walls, and still the storages sweated, cracked, and rotted. Then, in the same report, tucked into a small footnote, I found a sentence that stopped me. Local workers report that pre-existing stone chambers in adjacent areas maintain dry conditions and stable temperatures for decades of use prior to demolition. Exact construction methods unknown. Unknown again. I found similar stories in other project reviews. Near Tokmak, chronic humidity, grain rot, ventilation failures. Near Berdyansk, unstable temperatures, spoiled reserves. Near Huliaipol, structural instability, early closure for safety reasons. And in every one of these cases, the new concrete complexes had been built within a few kilometers of older underground structures that had been recently demolished or sealed. The pattern was clear. The Soviets knew the old chambers were there. They had torn them down in the name of progress, and then tried to replace them with their own version, using superior 20th century methods. The replacements worked worse. How does that happen? The Soviets had steel, concrete, electric pumps, fans, and calculation. Tables. The earlier builders had stone, hand tools, geometry, and patience. Yet the stone chambers stayed dry and stable for centuries, while the concrete copies developed fatal flaws in a few short years. I showed these documents and comparison photos to an architect friend who specializes in historical building techniques. She studied the images, old vaults versus new concrete shells, and pointed out the difference in seconds. The old builders understood passive systems, she said. Look at the stone courses. Look at the curvature of the vaults. Every element is doing 3 jobs at once: carrying weight, guiding water, moving air. The geometry and mass are the technology. She tapped one of the photos of Soviet construction: flat ceilings, hard corners. This is brute force: rectangles, flat slabs, and then they try to fix the problems with layers of waterproofing and mechanical ventilation. When the pumps fail, when the sealant cracks, and they always do, the whole system breaks down. The old builders were not just stacking rock and leaving it at that. They were building self-regulating environments. The stone mass absorbed temperature swings and released heat slowly. The shape of the vaults encouraged condensation to form, where it could drain away, not on the grain. The ventilation shafts created natural air movement based on pressure differences and wind, with no motors or wires. None of that was written in a textbook. None of it was codified in engineering manuals. When the Soviets demolished those old structures, they did not just remove stone. They erased the working memory embedded in the walls. They measured, yes. They drew cross-sections. They noted dimensions. But they did not understand why the proportions were what they were, why the shafts were placed where they were, why the curves had those exact radii. They tried to copy the function without understanding the form. It is like trying to reproduce a violin by measuring one and then building a wooden box with the same outline. You can match the length and width, carve F-holes in the right place, even use similar wood. But if you do not understand what makes the instrument resonate, you will not get music. You will get a lifeless box that only looks right from a distance. The old builders knew something about materials, about shape, about working with natural forces instead of fighting them. That knowledge is gone. We live in an age of simulations and engineering software, yet we still struggle to recreate what some unknown builders achieved with stone, lime, and an understanding of how air and heat move through the earth. We tell ourselves this is progress. But when you look at those failed copies and the ruins they replaced, It feels less like progress and more like a kind of carefully managed forgetting, not advancement, amnesia. There was one site I had never managed to reach, one location that kept surfacing in my notes, always, whispered about, never documented. The locals had a name for it: the palace under the steppe. I heard that phrase 3 times, from 3 different people who had never met each other. An elderly farmer near Tokmak, a historian who had worked in the regional archives before they were reorganized in the 1990s, a retired geological surveyor who had done ground studies there in Soviet times. Each of them described the same place. Each insisted it was the largest of all the underground complexes, and each swore it had been sealed and hidden so thoroughly that even finding the entrance now was almost impossible. The surveyor gave me coordinates, not exact ones, he claimed. He didn't remember precisely, and maybe that was true, maybe it was caution, but they were close enough to draw a circle on the map. I could not risk going myself, not after what happened at Velik Tovmecha. But there was one thing I could do: rebuild it on paper. For about 6 months, I collected every scrap of information I could find: old architectural sketches from the 1870s, drawn before the final demolition orders, ground-penetrating radar data from a survey in the late 1990s that had never been fully classified, testimony from workers involved in the sealing operations in the 1950s, even fragments of folk memory passed down through families in nearby villages. Then I hired a 3-dimensional visualization specialist. I told him it was for a historical documentary, which technically was true. And together we began to reconstruct what this complex might have looked like. What emerged on his screen did not look like a warehouse. It looked like a cathedral, underground. The main hall stretched for more than 200 meters. The vaulted ceiling rose about 7 meters at its highest point, supported by rows of stone pillars placed at exact, repeating intervals. The pillars were not just thick supports, they were carved. The same geometric motifs I had seen on other chamber walls ran up their sides, circles within circles, interlocking angles, repeating symbols covering almost every surface. Branching off the main axis were side galleries, dozens of them. Each one had barrel-vaulted ceilings, the same clean, precise stonework, the same sense of deliberate proportion. Some of these spaces were clearly storage halls, broad rooms with raised platforms where sacks or jars could be kept off the floor, easy to ventilate and easy to access. But others were different, small alcoves, almost chapel-like. In one worker's written account from the 1950s, he described these rooms as having carved seats along the walls and central stones that looked like altars in what was supposed to be a grain warehouse. The overall layout was anything but random. When we mapped the reconstructed plan from above, the entire complex formed a cross, a precise cross, aligned with the cardinal. Directions. The main entrance faced east. The longest gallery ran east to west. Side chambers extended north and south in mirrored patterns. It is the same basic plan you find in medieval churches and ancient temples. Spaces built not only for function, but for ritual, for gathering, for meaning. And there was another layer. The geological survey data showed that certain key chambers sat directly beneath particular limestone formations that were known to create acoustic effects. In those spots, a person standing at the right point could have their voice resonate through multiple rooms at once. The old surveyor told me one more thing, something he said he had been ordered not to talk about at the time. When his team first opened the sealed entrance in the 1950s, before demolition began, the chambers were not empty. There was grain inside, ancient dried grain stored in ceramic vessels arranged in orderly rows. Samples were taken. Even after what the scientists estimated as centuries underground, the grain was still identifiable: wheat, barley, and several varieties that did not match any modern local strains. In the central hall, under what the surveyor called the Star Chamber, a room whose ceiling was carved with intricate geometric patterns that seemed to mark astronomical alignments, they found something more: seeds. Thousands upon thousands of seeds, not meant for eating, but for planting, sorted by type, stored in dedicated containers, marked with carved symbols that likely served as labels. The Soviets removed everything. They took samples for study, cataloged the rest, then ordered the complex sealed and destroyed. The surveyor never learned what became of those samples. He assumed they ended up in some forgotten collection box in Moscow, marked as routine agricultural material. What stayed with him, the reason he was still willing to talk decades later, was not just the artifacts, it was the atmosphere. It felt sacred, as he told me, like we were walking into a temple, not a storage cellar. The other men felt it too. None of us wanted the job. It was not only old, it felt important, as if we were breaking something we would never be able to replace. This was not just a warehouse. It was a vault, a seed bank, a place where food and knowledge were stored side by side, where the survival of a people was planned for in terms of centuries, not seasons. A cathedral built not to worship the past, but to protect the future. And we entombed it under concrete and silence. So, what was Tartaria, or whatever we choose to call them, really hiding beneath the steppe? I have spent 2 years on this trail, thousands of kilometers by train and car, hundreds of files in dim reading rooms, nights in cheap hotels, days dodging fences and officials, and at least once, the real risk of arrest just to look into a hole in the ground. And after all of that, I keep circling back to one simple question. What were they storing? The obvious answer is practical. Grain, seeds, salt, tools, metal. The basic things you need if you want to keep people alive when the surface fails. And yes, those things were there. We have reports of ancient grain in ceramic jars, seed vessels arranged in rows, traces of salt in metal fittings. The physical evidence backs that up. But the more I look at it, the more I think that is only the surface answer. What they were really storing was something deeper: stability. Think about the mindset behind this. Whoever designed this network did not just want to get through one bad harvest. They built a buffer against disaster itself, against war, drought, crop failure, the collapse of kingdoms, the kind of slow-motion civilizational crash that usually writes whole regions out of history. They created infrastructure that is robust, hidden, and cleverly tuned to the physics of stone, air, and temperature. Infrastructure that can sit in the dark, quietly doing its job for centuries, with very little help from anyone on the surface. They were not planning for the next season. They were planning for the next dark age. These were not warehouses in the way we think of warehouses. They were insurance policies against extinction. And here is the part that will not leave me alone. It worked. We do not know exactly for how long. The records are broken, the timeline's foggy. But every clue points to the same conclusion. These underground systems stayed usable for hundreds of years. They bridged wars, regime changes, and those primitive centuries we are taught to imagine as chaotic and fragile. The grain kept moving. Export numbers stayed strangely steady. Cities that should have starved during failed harvests somehow did not. Armies were fed after wars that should have emptied every barn. Why? Because somewhere under the grass, in chambers no tax inspector could easily see, there were reserves. Then new powers arrived, the Russian Empire. Later, the Soviet state. They did what conquerors always do. They took inventory. They found traces of this network. They realized how valuable it was. And for a while, they used it. But they also feared it, because to rely on it meant admitting something uncomfortable, that they were tenants, not architects, that someone before them, someone whose name has fallen out of our history books, had already built continent-spanning infrastructure they themselves could barely maintain, never mind recreate from scratch. So they reached for the oldest tool of power. They rewrote the story. They reclassified the chambers as obsolete military objects and hazardous underground structures. They filed demolition orders. They turned seed vaults and acoustic corridors into rubble and fill. They poured concrete where questions lived and locked whatever answers they found behind national security stamps. Not because the stone rooms were about to kill anyone, because the questions inside those rooms could. Questions like, who were these builders? What else did they construct that we now walk over without knowing? How much of their science and engineering did we quietly inherit without understanding? And the most unsettling question of all, are we actually more advanced than they were, or have we just traded depth of understanding for an illusion of progress? Look at the contrast. We struggle to build underground spaces that keep stable temperatures and humidity without constant mechanical support. We cannot design passive acoustic corridors that carry a human voice clearly across long distances without electronics. We talk about seed banks, but we still wrestle with how to keep seeds viable for more than a few decades. Whoever built these chambers could do all of that with stone, lime, air, and geometry. I cannot tell you exactly who they were. I do not know the name they used for themselves. I cannot put an exact date on when the first vault was cut from the rock. Tartaria might be close to the truth, or it might just be the last distorted echo of a much older name. It is entirely possible that even the legends have been wiped clean. What I can say is this: the steppe is not empty. It has never been empty. It is a lid, a thin skin of soil and grass floating on top of a system built by hands that thought in centuries, not election cycles. Hands that understood something we have mostly forgotten: that the real measure of a civilization is not just what it displays on the surface, but what it quietly protects underneath. Those roads that led to nowhere were not mistakes on old maps. They led to key nodes in that system. The humming hills are not random bumps in the terrain. The sinkholes that open after heavy rains are not just unlucky geology. They are scars, places where the hidden structure pushes back into view. Every time we seal another one with concrete, stamp another report, or move a box of demolition photos into deeper storage, we make the same decision: to keep forgetting. To keep walking forward with our eyes straight ahead instead of looking down into the holes that keep opening at our feet. But here is the thing I have learned from 2 years of chasing these ghosts. Some structures are very hard to bury. A farmer drives his tractor across familiar ground, and suddenly the earth swallows a circle beneath him, revealing stone. A bored archivist misfiles a box, and demolition photos slip into the wrong catalog for someone like me to find decades later. A surveyor ignores an order to stay silent and tells the truth to a stranger with a microphone. A civilization can try to erase its own past, but stone does not sign secrecy agreements. If we once had networks of hidden safety running under entire regions, systems so subtle and effective that our concrete copies cannot match them, then the obvious question is, what else have we lost? What other knowledge lies buried, not just in the soil of the steppe, but in the ground beneath every comfortable story we tell about linear progress? And maybe the most important question is this: what would change if, instead of sealing every inconvenient opening, we started treating those openings as invitations? The chambers are still there, waiting. The stones remember, even if we have taught ourselves not to. The only real question now is, are we finally ready to remember with them?